And I am going to be recording this session today so I can send it out to anyone that was not able to attend in person. So my name is Molly Yanis, and I'm the CEO and project manager at Echo Consulting, a project management consulting firm. And today we're here to discuss conflicting priorities, which is one of the biggest pain points that teams face in the world today and the teams today. And so today we're going to focus on strategies, tools, and tactics to overcome conflicting and competing priorities. Throughout the presentation today, we have a couple of quotes to get our mind in the right place. The first one is action expresses priorities. Again, webinar goal for today, providing immediately actionable strategies, tools, and tactics to overcome. We want you to be able to take this webinar, the tools you learned today, and immediately apply them to your day-to-day work. You may want to have paper, pen, and or a tablet available today. There are going to be some interactive components or notes you'll want to jot down. Just to mention, I will be recording the session. I will be providing this session out for everyone to have a recording of, and I will also be providing these slides in PDF form, so no need to scribble notes on that or take rapid screenshots. Again, my name is Molly Yanis, and I work for Echo Consulting. We're going to start off with just a couple of definitions, both priority, prioritize, and prioritization, very similar. I've highlighted a couple of keywords on what we're going to be focusing on today. So we are going to be focusing on the treatment of projects and initiatives versus just what we say is the highest priority. There is sometimes a difference, as you may be well aware. In terms of prioritization, we are going to talk about relative importance versus just saying something is a high priority or medium. Is one priority higher than another priority in an explicit relative terms? And then from a prioritization standpoint, we are going to be getting into the actual process by which we prioritize versus our instinctual process from knowledge that we keep in our head, an actual kind of documented process associated with prioritization today. So I am going to actually jump right in, and I am going to go forward with the first tool, the list. This is classic. We're going to start off with an interactive experience. So throughout our examples of tools and strategies today, we're going to use the example or the scenario of your home is on fire. So in rapid succession, I'm going to give you 15 seconds to think about this. If your house is on fire, what are the things that you want the firefighters to help you get out of your house? So take 10 seconds to think about that. It's that rapid fire. What are your priorities? And you're just going to jot down a list. All right. I'm hoping that if there are any people that live with you, that your people are on your list. And if you have other living beings like pets, probably as well. You might care about technology or photos. Maybe you have some books. You certainly have some place to sleep, clothing, and food in that house as well. So if you are thinking of things that you might want to get out of your house, these might be some of the things on your list. Now, for applicable to businesses, please note that the order in which you think of things that are on your list is not always the order of priority, right? So the first thing you think of is not necessarily the highest priority item. That's okay. When you're initially making that list of things that are on your priorities, you want to get everything down on paper and documented. And then we will talk about how to actually assign priority to them over the series of the webinar today. Really quick, if I was looking at this more from a business standpoint, a little bit less from an icon and picture standpoint, an example of a priority list. This sounds crazy, our priorities, but there are so many clients that I've worked with that don't actually have a list of their priorities, either from a team standpoint or from an individual standpoint, right? They're on random notes or sticky notes or emails, but actually having every single thing written down in terms of what your priorities are, and being able to reference that is a critical first step. So if you do not have a list, this is a very basic priority list you could grab in either Google Sheets or Excel. Basically, you want to have a description of what it is. This can be separated, but whether you have an owner or a requester or both, you have this concept of a high level priority, critical, high, medium, low. This isn't relative. This is just, what your instinct is, what the status is, whether it's open, you're in progress, you're working on it. And then there's some other components as well we'll be talking about later on today. So again, first step, if you want to do, you want to know about how to prioritize, how to deal with conflicting and competing priorities, you actually need a list of what those things are. Next quote, when you're riding, the only race in which you're riding, when you're riding, only the race in which you are riding is important. So the first tool was the list. The first strategy we're going to talk about is eliminate. So, well, it would be great to get everything out of your burning house and be able to recover it all. That's not most likely the case. And seeing as you're risking the firefighters' lives, you probably want to eliminate some of the things on your list of what you want to take out of your house, right? So I'm hoping that you might not ask firefighters to go in and grab your couch. There's a couple of different reasons. One, from a budget standpoint, you probably can afford to replace your couch versus pay for the life of someone else. The other component of this is honestly, it is resources, right? In terms of people, you only have a certain number of people there. You only have a certain amount of time available because your house is on fire. So again, we need to kind of eliminate some of these lower level priorities so that we can focus on what's most important. Hopefully your family, any living beings, and some photos. If we take this, one more bonus tactic I want to mention. So the Warren Buffett's rule, if you've ever heard it, it's easily Googleable. So Warren Buffett has a rule. It's called the 25-5 rule. So his goal is, having 25 items on his prioritization list, but he only focuses and looks at the first 5 at any given time. So basically he has blinders on to the top 5. And aside from that, they don't exist until those top 5 are resolved. So again, if you're looking for a bonus tactic for prioritization and you've heard of Warren Buffett, his tactic is the 25-5 rule. Tactic number 1, we're going to be talking about schedule. The key is not to prioritize what's on your schedule, but to schedule your priorities. So we're going to talk about that both from an individual standpoint as well as from a team standpoint. So from an individual standpoint, you may have seen this. I'm looking at just a blank week. And what you'll notice is that I've actually blocked off time in a calendar to put my heads down and actually work on a priority or a project. Now, you may have seen this strategy to actually block off your calendar for time. It may or may not work for you in your organization. People might schedule over this. What you may not have seen before is this concept of spending time at the end of the day working on your priority ahead of your big block of time. This is an important strategy for scheduling time because it allows you to get some of the planning components, the big questions. If you are going to be blocked on something in this big chunk of time, you're identifying that the day before and give you a time to deal with those and ask those questions to other individuals so that when you're actually going in to put your heads down time, you actually can focus on the work during that. So this is, again, a personal strategy for prioritization, blocking off your calendar for big chunks of time. The recommendation is to do that in the morning. The added piece I just want to mention is making time the day before, if you can do it even a couple of days before, but definitely the day before, to make sure that you've planned out that heads down time and that if there are any dependencies you have on other people, documentation, anything you need to look up, that you're doing that research and that planning the day before so that when you're doing your heads down time, you actually have time to focus. Okay? It's not about having time, it's about making time. So what I want to talk about really quick from a schedule standpoint for prioritization, first is a really high level process. So when we think about how we get new priorities or new things that are added to our list, that is called intake. So how do we get that? Now that might be a conversation in a hall, not right now because of COVID, but it could be an email, it could be a chat from either your manager or some other manager or a teammate that's asking you to help on something, right? That is called the intake process. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how we could formalize that intake process today, but there's this concept that there are requesters. You might be the requester. You might say, hey, this is a priority. I need to add this to my list, right? But there's an intake process. Then there's this concept of reviewing and assigning, and then there's actually the completing the work. The piece that most teams and individuals miss is this review and assign phase, right? We have this intake, we have this idea, we add this priority to our list. And then somehow it just gets to the top of our list, right? Because it's the thing that we're thinking of in that exact moment, right? And then we just start completing that work, right? But really a critical component of this process is intake, idea, process, right? And then review, assign priority, and then complete the work. Okay. Now, in a larger team, this requesters, reviewers, and doers teams might be larger. The requesters might be, you know what I mean, an entire company, might be asking for accounting to do something at close time, or, you know what I mean, there's a new season or something like that for marketing. So this intake process can be much larger for large teams, or it can literally just be a single person being like, here's all the tasks and projects and initiatives that I'm a part of. And then complete work may or may not be the person that requests, and it may or may not be the person that reviews. Again, larger teams, there's this concept of there's people that review, maybe it's a manager, maybe it's a senior leadership team, and then the work gets assigned. So again, this piece that a lot of times is missing in the process is this review and assign the priority and initiatives component in an explicit way, in a documented way. I broke this high level process down one level further just to think a little bit more about making this a little bit more formal. So I work with teams to really break out this intake process, break out this, and provide additional visibility and communication across teams. So if we look at it from the requester's perspective, especially when the requester isn't the person that's actually doing the work, the requester could, for example, fill out a form. If you're filling out a form, then you have all the information that you need to provide, versus an email or a conversation in the hall where you may not have all the information you need to actually complete the task or project or initiative. So having this intake form available to everyone where they can kind of fill it out, and then after that intake form is submitted, the requester wants to know what the status is. Is someone actually working on this? When am I going to get it? What is the priority? And then at the end, once it's actually been completed, they want to be able to approve it, right? I requested it. I want to now know, hey, did you deliver what I asked you to deliver? So the requester's role, submit the information for the request, see the status so they know what the status is, when they should expect it, and then approve that they have delivered. The reviewer's perspective, they want to actually see what this intake form says, review it, and they want to prioritize against all the other projects and initiatives, right? We'll dive into this review and assign process in a moment. And then once they have and they've assigned out the work to the doer, they want to see the status that the person that's actually doing the work is at too, right? Whether that's a project status report, whether that's just a, updated timeline or something like that. And again, a lot of this is typically informal in organizations. I work with teams to make this process a little bit more formal. It's one of the things that I work on. And then the doer, they get assigned this work. They're going to complete the work, and then they want to assign it back to the requester to say, "Yep, I've actually done this work. I've completed it. Can you approve?" And during that time, they want to make sure that the requester is acknowledging that they've completed the work. So towards that end, what I like to propose, we at the very beginning, we talked about an individual schedule, right? This is how I manage my priorities. This is how I have head down time. From a team perspective, we need to schedule time to review the incoming requests and prioritize them. we need to have some visibility across, not just our schedule, but also our team's schedule to understand where we are on the priorities and make sure that we are aligned. And then there is a component as well that oftentimes I call quarterly, which is alignment with the business organization as a whole. So if I think about weekly, this might be an individual one-on-one with your manager. This may be a weekly team meeting. This is a monthly review. This is typically at a team department level. And then the quarterly can sometimes be like an entire division, like in operations or, a finance um, vertical in terms of organization. Okay, so it depends. Depends on your needs as a team, but this is like a cadence that you might consider so that you're reviewing all the requests that you have. Make sure that they're in order. You know what you should be working on. Make sure that your team is aligned as a whole to meet your goals, and then that quarterly component as well to make sure you're aligned with your organization. So I just want to take a moment, take a breath. I talk fast. So today we're going to be talking about strategies, tools, and tactics. Today, so far, we've just reviewed the very basic ones, right? So the tool is having a list of all the things that are on the priority. The strategy, the first strategy is to eliminate priorities, right? So that you really are focused on a targeted list, and that it's clean and up to date. And then the tactic we just talked about is how you might schedule time for prioritization and schedule priorities against each other. And we'll talk about schedule again a little bit later on. So other strategies, tools, and tactics we'll be covering in the remainder of the workshop today, webinar today, is we're going to talk about strategies trading off priorities and alignment of your team. We're going to talk about prioritization drivers. So what oftentimes is kept in our head about what is a priority and why something is a higher priority than another. Those are called prioritization drivers. And we will be looking actually at a prioritization matrix example. And then we'll talk about a couple other tactics. The Ivy Lee method and the Eisenhower method are probably two of the more well-known ones in terms of how to manage priorities. Any questions at this point in terms of topics, tools that we're going to be covering today, or anything that I've said so far? All right, I'll keep going. And then for any new attendees, just letting you guys know, I am recording the session. Strategy number 2, trade-offs. It's a little bit blurry, but really quick from the poll results. I asked the question, when you ask what is the priority, what do you really mean? Okay. The options were, do you need this now? So if someone says, what is the priority? They mean like, do I need to drop everything and do this right this second? Do you mean which comes first, this or that? What is the priority? This is the priority or that is the priority. Is this a suggestion or need? So think about asking your manager, being like, is this like, what is the priority? Being like, do you really need this right now? Or do you really need this? And then is this aligned with our goals? So when you say what is the priority, is like, is this really, a priority for our company, for our team right now? So it looks like the poll results are primarily when people say what is the priority, they're saying which comes first, this or that. So that's going to lead off into our next exercise. So again, our first exercise, we're going to keep going with this theme of my house is on fire. Okay. Now, when we think about that and you have that list of items that you guys had initially written down in terms of the things you want to get out of your house. Okay. The first thing is that you can think about this or that and look at it in a single, this or that. So I've provided a couple of examples. Would you save your family or would you save your books, right? Would you save your family or would you save your dog? Now, I don't want you to answer this out loud. I know that some people might have different results there. Dog versus your technology, your computer, or photos versus your computer. When you make it explicit, this or that, the ability of a manager or a person to make that decision is easier than if you have a list of 12 things on your list and you're like, what is the priority, right? You're being explicit with your questions. And we're going to talk about specific questions you can ask if you're in that situation of you've got too much on your list and you're trying to figure it out and you want to align with your manager, you want to align with your team. How do we do that? But for right now, the first strategy is trade-offs, this or that. So I am going to share mine. family, not my dog, my family, dog versus my computer, and actually my computer versus my photos. And again, these are personal priorities, but I have a lot of photos on my computer and technology. Okay. So this is this concept of this or that. What is higher priority, this or that? Quote, someday is not a day of the week. So really quick, we're going to go back to that definition component. So analysis paralysis. So one of the things that happens oftentimes when we're trying to prioritize is that we end up over analyzing, and this prioritization is just, it's frankly overwhelming. And so what we end up doing is we end up like freezing up, and we get paralyzed, and we end up not solutioning at all. And what we do is we just, like, whatever we think of or whatever's been asked of us most recently, that's what we work on, because we're just not ready. It's too hard to think about what is the highest priority. So one of the strategies to overcome that, and a terminology I really like, is called progressive elaboration. So it's this concept of, it's okay that you don't have all the information and you don't have all of the inputs at any given moment when you're making these prioritization decisions of, I'm going to work on this versus that. What's important is that as additional information comes in, is you're taking into consideration and you're constantly elaborating and having better information and using that information to narrow down what your priority is. Okay. So I'm going to use this example again, back to our house that's on fire. You are never going to think of priority again without thinking of your house on fire and some of those decisions I made you make between, your dog and your family. But anyways, so your house is on fire. Now, you might have more than one pet. So when you first wrote down your list, you're saying like, oh my gosh, my pets, right? But what if the firefighter goes in and you've got a dog and a cat and a fish and a hamster, and they're all in different parts of your house, right? So we need to be more specific about what we're asking, and we need to be more specific about what we're prioritizing. Sometimes the buckets that we do in our high level list and our high level prioritization checklist are not enough. So this is that progressive elaboration. Same thing with a computer. Like, okay, we all have a lot of technology in our house, right? You might have a tablet in your bedroom. You might have a desktop up in your office. You might have a laptop that, oh, you left on the kitchen counter, right? We need to be more specific. Same thing with photos. You probably have albums. You've got a camera somewhere. You've got photos on your wall. We don't want to be sending people in and out running into a burning building. If you're saying that you need to collect photos and what you really mean is you need those albums of your parents' like wedding anniversary, you need to be more specific. So this is that concept of progressive elaboration. What really is on your priority list? Okay. And then we're going to circle back on that asking better questions components. So we talked about, is the trade-off. Is this a higher priority or that? So when you're passing by in the hallway, post, COVID, obviously, but you're having this conversation, maybe it's your manager, maybe it's not your manager, maybe it's someone else that you work with, and they're saying like, hey, can you get that to me by Friday? Like, I really need this and everything. Well, they don't know everything else on your list. You know everything on your list. That may or may not need to go through your manager. That may or may not need to be someone else on your team helping out. It needs to be delegated, right? That person asking may not have that information. Okay, so there's a couple of strategies that you as an individual can do, and you can coach your team on how to do, to ask better questions, to really dive a little bit deeper into what the priority is, not just saying that cop out of like, what is the priority, and just throwing it up. You know what I mean? So the first one is this, being explicit what this is, right? What the request is, a higher priority than that. That's a great example if the work that you're already working on is something that that same person has requested. So you're, asking them an explicit question. Hey, you already gave me this. Which one of these two things is the most important? Okay. Another way to say that is being explicit. Should I stop working on this and work on that? Will it work if I deliver? This is even better if you can actually get to a point of dates, right? So it's like, what if, if I deliver this on this date, so I can deliver that on that date. So giving them specific targets, being like, you know what, it might not be Friday, but if I do this by Friday, then I'm not going to get this other thing done. So giving them information so that they have what they need to be able to help guide you on what's most important. Acknowledging, right? I know this is important. I could use support from this person to make it happen. I'm concerned about the dependency, right? So if you're working on something that has a dependency on another project, making sure that you're calling out that dependency in the question. If it's someone that's outside of your, your specific department, but, maybe a senior, making sure that you are acknowledging that you're going to let that person know and let them make the prioritization, but that you as an individual will follow up on them and tell them, what the results of that conversation was. So again, informing them, giving them the tools so that they really know what to expect. Any questions about progressive elaboration, asking better questions than just what is the priority, or just accepting the request and not acknowledging it or putting any dates associated with it? Quiet crowd. All right, the Ivy Lee method. Ivy Lee method, pretty straightforward. I provided a link on this one. It's something that I definitely do internally, and it's made a big difference for me. So the Ivy Lee method is the idea that instead of starting your day out, writing down what your priorities are, top 3 priorities, that you actually should be finishing your day by doing that. So before you sign off for the day, before you sign off for the night, hopefully the day, you're writing down what your highest priorities are and writing them down in order. And I usually actually call this my top 3. So I don't call it the Ivy League method. I just call it my top 3. I write down what my top 3 are for the day tomorrow and technically for the rest of the week at the end of the day. And then I work on those tasks one at a time. There's something called decision fatigue early in the morning. You probably heard it too in terms of like checking your email before you get out of bed. The goal is in the morning is to focus on the actual doing component. You want to push off things that are going to tire you out or stress you out really early in the morning when you have kind of that max brain power. So whenever possible, you write down what your highest priority are at the end of the workday so that when you're coming in, you already know what those 3 are. You don't have to think about what those 3 are. You don't have to be overwhelmed by your email. The first thing is like, these are my top 3 priorities. This is what I need to work on. Now, the only thing that we know is steady is that things are going to change. That's okay. The goal is to not be starting out your day figuring out what those 3 things are and changing, but instead finishing your day with it. The Eisenhower method. Hoping you guys have seen this before. This is that concept of important versus urgent. Okay, so something might be important but not urgent. Something might be urgent but not important. So something that needs to happen right this second, but it's really, frankly, not important in the grand scheme of things. And really, we're missing opportunities by doing only the things that are urgent and immediate versus the things that are actually important long term from like a strategic growth perspective. So we're going to go back to our handy example of the burning house. And we're going to say that getting our family out of that burning house is both important and urgent. We're going to say the same thing about our dog. But frankly, our couch, it's just not that important and urgent. Maybe your couch is, but not mine. Books, right? It's unfortunate, but I can get them back. I've got a Kindle account. We'll figure it out. Not urgent, but very important. You do need clothing and you need a place to sleep tonight, and it's probably not your burning house, but it's not urgent in that moment to deal with that priority. Your photos are definitely probably not as important as your family, but it is urgent because if you leave them in the burning house, they will be no more. Okay. So again, this is like a simplified, it's not even simplified, but it's an example that I'm trying to kind of, kind of drive into your head, right? Is this burning building when you're thinking about priorities, fire, but filling out this Eisenhower method. So taking your list of everything that's on your plate and thinking, is this urgent, but not important? The biggest opportunities missed in terms of team growth is in this space of things that are important, but not as urgent, right? Spend a lot of time working on things that are urgent, but maybe not as important. So people tend to be able to rank things in terms of importance pretty well, but this urgency piece, not as much. So something that is less urgent, but more important oftentimes gets missed. Okay. Lack of direction, not lack of time, is the problem. We all have 24-hour days. Strategy number 3, alignment. All right, so when we think about prioritization and we've created our list and we've done some trade-offs and things like that, I'm sorry for my bad handwriting on my whiteboard. I am a whiteboard fiend. I want to be clear that when you're prioritizing something, that there are several levels that you're prioritizing usually against, okay? So there's often strategic initiatives for your organization. Those are usually defined either in kind of like an annual or a multi-year roadmap. These are the strategic initiatives of our organization. Hopefully those are communicated out. Hopefully those are aligned. There's also specific leadership initiatives. So these are oftentimes middle management or senior management, and they have their goals for their team, like operations and service and sales, right? There's actual individual team goals. So accounts payable might have different goals, for example, that are called out just for accounts payable in their space versus the entire finance organization that your CFO or controller might have versus the strategic initiatives at the company level. And then there are also things, I call them below the line. Don't quote me, don't quote me if you're accountant. My husband's an accountant. But so for below the line, I think about more like manager and individual goals and priorities. These are still extremely important, but maybe they're not articulated quite as explicitly as we, develop out our prioritization process and framework. All right. So in this example, again, company and strategic goals, executive leadership goals, team and department managers goals, individual work goals, direct reports goals, and personal goals. Personal goals are also important. So if we think about this, if you have a team member, for example, that has a really young family or, a sick spouse or, whatever those are, or that your direct reports goals are really to move up in the company and to have some more leadership. These are important components in terms of how you would manage something, who you would give these different work to. But again, they don't usually come into play explicitly in priority mapping, but they are kind of implicit in the way that we assign certain things out. Okay. So yes.
The middle of the table, I can't see it that well. Are those supposed to be individual goals or the teams that are affected by the initiative?
When you say team department goals, I'm sorry, I missed what you said, Jay.
So in the middle of this grid, you have all of those. Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
are those teams that are affected or individual goals for each of those?
Yeah, these aren't goals. These are actually projects or initiatives that are ranked, and we'll talk about these in a second. So I usually have the level of here, and then in this case, you do have the actual strategic initiative goals. Leadership initiatives tend to be like at a project level or perhaps a little bit bigger. So like split a business split 2 business departments or something like that, or launch product A in 6 months. So it's a higher level goal that needs to get broken down into individual projects or initiatives. So launching product A might be a strategic leader like the COO or the CPO or something like that has that as their initiative. But the project is going to be probably like product 1, product A pilot, the marketing launch plan for that product, the sales training on the product. Those are usually like either sub projects or activities underneath it. So you get a little bit more granular as you move further down, and a little bit more measurable, to be honest, unfortunately, but that is usually how it works.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We'll look at that example in the prioritization matrix as well, Jay, so that might provide a little bit more detail for you. So I do want to just take a pause here and think about strategies to help your team pivot. So priorities change, and they compete with one another, and it's not always a clear trade-off, this or that. There are often more components in play. And so when you think about it from a team leadership perspective, I've called out just a couple of things to help your team pivot. All right. So the first one is communicate, communicate, communicate. So as I mentioned in the very, very first tool, you would be surprised at how many teams and individuals do not actually have a list of their priorities, let alone have them ranked at the levels that we just talked about in terms of like corporate, mapping them back to the actual corporate priorities and strategic initiatives versus their leader versus their manager versus their team. So the number one thing, if I can get out of here, is really having that list of priorities. It sounds simple. Most teams do not have this. That second piece is, and as a leader, your job is to make sure that you are communicating those priorities over and over, that you are mapping those priorities back to the big picture so that your team knows how they are contributing to the overall success of your organization and of your team. So again, they're not just, completing this AP cleanup. They are, doing that so that we have the revenue that we need so that the sales can happen, or so that the expansion can happen, so we get the funding so that we can get the product A launched. It's a lot bigger. And so always mapping those priorities of these individual components back to the whole and understanding like how that spoke works in terms of the whole wheel. The other piece I want to say is planning time for prioritization, both as a leader and someone that has to prioritize people that might report to you or team that reports to you, but also making time for them to weigh in and identify their ideas of things that are their priorities, in terms of things that might be painful for them or inefficient for them, and helping them and coaching them on how to express that relative priority so that you're not just getting something like, what is the priority, right? There's not a ton of information, just not a ton that a leader can do with like, what is the priority? They need a little bit more information. So that is where from the top, you need to make sure that those are documented and that you're articulating those down, and make sure you're mapping it back to the big picture. You need to make sure that you're making time for prioritization as an individual so that you're reviewing all the work that's in there and making sure that you're cleaning it and grooming that backlog. And then also making time with your team to both articulate those priorities and also get feedback on those priorities as well. And then finally, guess what? Projects are going to get canceled. Priorities are going to change. That is what that's what happens, right? So we as leaders need to be able to lead through change in a positive way. And so a couple of tips is, acknowledging the value of the work done to date. So we're not sweeping it under the rug. We're not going to ignore that it happened. We are acknowledging the value of the work to date. You're calling it out. You still want to make sure that you're getting the lessons learned and things like that. It is good to allow for grief, right? That means if someone has spent the last 2 months working on this or it's something that they are like really personally invested in and you're having to have them pivot, allow time for grief. The only feedback I would provide on that is make sure that the amount of time that you're allowing for grief is relative to the amount of time worked. So if you worked on it in a day and someone worked on something for a day, it's frustrating, what, you lose a day at work, but like don't waste a day of work grieving about that, both as an individual as well as a leader. Don't allow that, like hold accountable. You need to be able to pivot. If something's a couple of months, right, then like typically I would say, a week of grief is pretty normal. Right. And when you're talking about grief in a business sense, like I'm talking about the fact that, what, there's going to be some distraction, there's going to be some side conversations, there's going to be some frustration. That's okay. Give space, give safe space for that, but then also provide alternatives on how to redirect some of that energy. And again, that's mapping back to the big picture. Where possible, highlight the dependencies and synergies. So like that work isn't just being thrown down the tube. It really, you know what I mean? You learned lessons from that. It might have actually spawned the idea that led to this new priority. There might be synergies between the two where you can reuse some of it. It might be able to be passed off. So where you can, you know what I mean, redirecting some of that as well. Anyone else have any strategies in terms of helping your team pivot that they want to share? No one is always busy. It just depends on what number you are on their priority list. Prioritization drivers. So we talked a little bit about it when we were talking about those strategic initiatives and the leadership initiatives, but now I'm actually talking about articulating specific drivers that you would potentially rank a project or a initiative or a task against. So I just provided a couple of really high level ones. We're going to look at this in an example of the prioritization matrix in a moment, but some of the driver examples are sales, profitability. If you have a strategic initiative for customer service or experience and improving that. I'm just going to give you a side note in terms of I'm very pro measurable goals, SMART goals. So these are high level prioritization drivers. As an organization, when you're identifying prioritization drivers, you would want to be a little bit more specific than the drivers I've called out. I'm trying to keep it relatively open so that you get the idea in my next example. But resourcing availability of a given team. So if sales lost 2 people this week and is totally underwater managing what they have, just be aware that the resourcing availability might not be there to do a new sales app project right then. There's compliance components in a lot of organizations, so you need to keep your licenses up. You might have like a HIPAA violation. You might have something from a compliance standpoint that you have to deal with. And there's a budget component, right? So budgets are allocated oftentimes at an annual level, and so annual basis. So moving budgets around can be difficult, getting budgets mid-year. So it might be opportunities that come in, and having to move that budget around is a blocker. So there are literally limitless prioritization drivers. I work with organizations to identify their specific drivers. When we talk about prioritization drivers, and we're going to go into the next step, which is actually a quantifiable prioritization matrix to actually get back to kind of numbers on priorities. Usually I'm recommending between 5 and 7 prioritization drivers. And then you can kind of break it down from there and change weight. So I'm going to show you that in a second, but these are just a couple really high level examples. So that was really setting me up for the prioritization matrix. So I'm going to just do a really quick kind of orientation to this matrix. Again, this is something that you would customize. The idea in going to a quantifiable view of prioritization is not to say that I'm always going to do the thing that is the highest number from a prioritization level. It is more of a guidance mechanism, and a mechanism that you can use to call out outliers and understand why those outliers exist. So at a high level, what I have here are my projects that are initiatives. Again, these are fake examples. But the pilot for product A, a marketing launch plan, the e-commerce website, a sales team field app, a new customer portal. So just trying to give you guys a couple of projects or initiatives that you might understand or be aligned with. And what I have across top are 6 examples of prioritization drivers that I might rank something against. So maybe there's an organizational goal, strategic goal to diversify revenue streams. We don't want to just be a one product company anymore. We want to launch a second or third product this year. We know that we have a huge gap right now in customer retention, and we're always having to get new customers in. So this is a high priority. Upgrading technical systems. So we put in budget. We know that if we're going to grow, we really need to build our foundations. So, this is that upgrade technical systems. Profitability, budget, resources available. So these are examples of prioritization drivers. Now, what I have here is this concept of 1 through 5. So when I look at product A, I'm not looking at anything below it. I'm just looking at product A. And what I'm doing is I'm ranking 5 being great, 1 being not great, 0 being really not really bad, right? And what I'm just doing is ranking in terms of how aligned it is with this prioritization driver. So pilot product A, this is 4 in terms of diversifying revenue streams, because this is exactly what we want to do. We're adding another product. But improving customer retention, the product A, it's going to help some clients out because, they're expanding and they need this other product too, but it probably isn't going to really keep, that many of ours. Upgrading technical systems, it doesn't really help us that much there. Profitability in the short term, maybe I've defined profitability in the next year, probably isn't going to help us be super profitable in the first year, but maybe in the second or third. We have budget aligned, we have resources available, okay? And what I've done here is just taken the average across these different examples. Now, next, what I've done is I've added this concept of weighting, okay? So for the weight, I am saying, you know what, each of these prioritization drivers, are not equally weighted. Some things are more important to us than others. So what I've done is I've actually added a weight here. And then what that allows me to do is instead look at the weighted average. So if I looked here, the most important project for me, based on just the average, is the e-commerce website. When I take into account the weighting that I have in my prioritization drivers, guess what? It's still the highest priority. That's great. But what I, and similarly, the marketing product launch, this is also really important. But what you'll notice is some things down here that maybe was like the second to least, important when you just averaged, but when it's weighted, it's actually more important. It's actually kind of like the third most important thing over here, right? Because the weighting of my prioritization drivers changes the priority. And again, I'm not suggesting that you just say, okay, this is our first priority, this is our second priority, we're not going to look at anything else. This is just a tool or mechanism for quantifying the priority across drivers and providing some visibility of that. Now, as I mentioned, you can be sure of change. And so towards that end, what I'm showing in this one is I'm actually saying, okay, you know what if I were to change the weighting of my prioritization drivers to be something else? Notice how the weighting of my goals, right, and my priorities has changed. Now I have this department reorg adding account management as a really critical component. It's actually the highest one, whereas it was middle of the pack in this group, right? So because I have weighted my improved customer retention as the highest priority driver right now, and I have decrease the weight of diversifying revenue streams, different projects become more important, or different tasks or initiatives. Does that make sense? So we have actually covered all of these different topics. So we talked about eliminating priorities, trading off between two priorities, and aligning priorities. We talked about the list, prioritization drivers, and we just did a really, really high level prioritization matrix. There's a lot more to designing that, but really it can just be done in Excel. There's some tools that you can use as well. We talked about scheduling our time versus letting our time schedule us, Ivy Lead method, and the Eisenhower method. If you're looking for more resources, I'm going to provide you a recording of this PDF, a recording and the PDF of this deck, and I'm going to include that in the LinkedIn group. I'm going to send out a really quick post-webinar survey. You're welcome to fill it out if you have feedback for me. I really appreciate it. And then also if you want to sign up for notifications on any new content. I am going to be offering a virtual masterclass specifically on creating a prioritization matrix for your team or organization. And that's going to be offered in September. And then I also offer workshops specific to organizations. So I'm actually customizing it to teams or departments. You have my information here. I'll send it out. You're welcome to schedule a meeting to introduce yourself one-on-one with me. I always like to make new connections. And then if you're looking for more free resources on different topics that I offer, I am going to be offering a webinar tomorrow, actually with another leader, Kate Berry, on using Microsoft Teams. We also are doing another webinar on how to adopt new tools and processes like the prioritization process. And then also I have a strategies for estimating time and effort. And I also have that masterclass I mentioned in terms of creating a prioritization matrix for new initiatives. With that, that is my content for today. It looks like we have 10 minutes left, which is perfect. Does anyone have any specific questions, feedback that they are comfortable offering in a group? All right. Well, I really appreciate your time, and I will send this out. And please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions, clarifications on any of the content that we offered today. I appreciate your time. Thanks, everyone.